All right, welcome everyone. We're here today to talk about accessibility in libraries. My colleague at the Museum of International Folk Art, Brian, went to this session when it was at the NMLA conference and was just raving about it. And I said, I'm so frustrated I wasn't able to make it to that one. And so I reached out to the Los Alamos Library and asked if they'd be willing to redo it, and kindly they said yes. So I'll take up no more time other than to say thank you, Los Alamos librarians. I'll let you introduce yourselves, but welcome, and we really appreciate you doing this. So go ahead and take it away. Thanks.
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, my name is Norma Covington, and I am here at the Los Alamos Public Libraries. I received my MLIS from the University of North Texas. I was previously in education and community works for almost 20 years before I became a librarian. So I'm second career. And I did some study, independent study in college during my master's on accessibility in graphic novels and comics. Audra, do you want to introduce yourself, or do you want me to go ahead? Can't hear you. I can't hear you, Audra. It may not be. Okay, I'll introduce you. Okay, so this is Audra. Audra is second career as well. I know Audra has a PhD, and you would never know because she's absolutely the most humble, personable person ever, but she's extremely passionate about accessibility, and especially working with persons who are homebound, who can't reach the library, and finding new ways to get to them. And so she's an incredible asset here at Los Alamos. And then we have a kind of a junior member that just came in to help us out today. And her name is Olivia. Olivia, can you say hello?
Yes, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name's Olivia Hayashi Groves, and I work at Youth Services at Mesa Public with Audra and Norma, who are just the best. And I am filling in for Christy Mackey, who presented at the NMLA conference and did a wonderful job, I heard. And I am excited to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about accessibility with so many great people.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if at any time you can't see and or hear something, please just let me know. Okay. So I'm going to go to slideshow, and we're going to start this from the beginning. All right. So this presentation is titled Examining Library Accessibility, because I specifically wanted to look into accessibility issues for the library. And again, our presenters are myself, Audra Short, Olivia, and we're from Los Alamos Public Libraries. An accessibility note here, let me hide this video, is that the presentation is available via email or link in the Zoom chat. And obviously, since we're using the transcription, you can also get the transcription. I think this is a very apt quote. It says, there is a 100% chance that you will be serving a patron with a disability in your library. And this is from Dr. Beth Padian, a library and information science professor at Syracuse. And those are pretty much the actual chances that on any given day, someone with a disability will be walking into your library. So when we're talking about accessibility, there's several things that we're talking about. We're talking about awareness of the issues. What is accessibility? Why do we, need to care about this? Another component would be training. What can we do to work on our accessibility? Evaluating yourself, your environment in the library, and anything else that you need to evaluate. And a huge component of this that I've learned by watching many trainings and reading lots and lots of stuff is that you have to have a willingness to fail, because you are going to mess up. I mess up all the time. And everyone who wants to work in accessibility just kind of needs to learn to live with the fact that they are going to make mistakes, and that is okay, that we are learning and doing better. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about removal of barriers. So who can work on accessibility? Anyone who has an interest in listening to persons with disabilities and to communities, learning more about accessibility, collaborating, and improving accessibility. It looks like we have someone in the chat maybe asking something. I don't have that up, so I'm going to ask if Audra or Olivia can drop in there and see if they can help. So we can all become aware of the issues, we can all advocate for accessibility, and we can all cultivate positive attitudes, which I found to be one of the hardest issues with accessibility. Where did my slide go? Now, according to the World Health Organization, disability has 3 dimensions: impairment, impairment, that would be impairment in movement, impairment in cognitive abilities, impairment in anything that we can think of along those lines. Activity limitation, which means that perhaps the way things are designed with a disability, you'd be limited in what you could participate in, which leads into the following part, which is participation restrictions. So there are different types of disabilities, and there are different ways that disabilities will affect what you have access to in our world. And we're going to talk a little bit more about access and accessibility. So accessibility is the measure of how easily persons can access something or participate in it. That doesn't just mean someone can physically reach it or they can get there. Accessibility needs to take into account inclusive needs when designing, modifying, or otherwise adapting spaces and services. So we're going to go into what this means a little bit more here. Why would we worry about accessibility? So in New Mexico, 1 in 4 adults has a disability or self-identifies as having a disability. About 12% have mobility issues, 13% have cognitive disabilities, 7% have hearing disabilities, and 5% have visual disabilities. This is about 28% of the population. If you are in a rural area in New Mexico, in rural areas, it tends to be closer to 1 in 3. So chances are even higher that many of your patrons have some kind of disability. So improving accessibility means addressing the barriers that prevent people from being able to access things. So barriers can be anything that either is there or is not there that limits function and creates a disability. And this includes aspects like the physical environment is not accessible. This is the one we think about the most, because when we talk about ADA accessibility, it generally describes or talks about physically being able to reach something. This can also include lack of relevant assistive technologies, things that are now widely available, but we just don't tend to provide on the whole in our society. A big one is negative attitudes of people towards disability. This doesn't just mean being ableist. This means also just being unaware and kind of not caring about whether things are accessible. And then services, systems, and policies that are in place that either knowingly or unknowingly create a lack of accessibility or a barrier for persons with disabilities. Okay. This is a really, really big one. Ableism, which is defined as discrimination or prejudice against individuals with disabilities. And we can have ableist beliefs without even knowing it. And I believe most of us do. We might resist necessary change. That's like when someone says, well, you need to change up your workflow to make this more accessible. And we think, oh my gosh, my workflow works so well. This is so annoying. Why do I have to change it? A really common one when you're talking to boards and administration and things like that is asking to see the business case. People saying things like, well, how many disabled patrons do we actually have? Well, who actually is going to use that? Is it only going to get used a little bit? So that's really an ableist thought pattern. People who nitpick accessibility requirements, who say, well, we can't make it perfect, so we just shouldn't change anything. Prioritizing new and accessible features. I see this a lot in electronic resources, new cool things that come out that have very, very low accessibility, but it's new and it's cool, so everyone wants to get it, rather than saying, why don't we, take or advocate what we have to make it more accessible, and minimizing the needs of accessibility community. So here's a kind of hard thing to hear that I think is really important. A quick way to check if something is ableist: replace the accessibility or disability component with race or gender. For example, I'm Hispanic, I'm Mexican, so I'm gonna use myself as an option or as a sample example. If I walked in someplace and I walked into your library and you said, well, we don't have computers for Mexican women. We don't have bathrooms for Mexican women. I mean, there's not that many of you that come in here, so you can't have a bathroom. Now, I can't see your faces right now, but I know when I've done this presentation before, people are just shocked, because of course you would be outraged to hear that. Well, that's exactly what we're saying when we're saying, well, how many disabled people are going to use this? Well, I mean, it costs a little more, so why would we do that? So when you replace accessibility or disability with race or gender and it sounds unacceptable, discriminatory, or offensive, it's probably ableist. All right, so I'm gonna say that there's a couple of different ways that we can talk about different types of disabilities, but a good distinction to make is we need to recognize our privilege by understanding what and who we are needing, who we are serving, and what we need to do. So libraries serve persons with invisible and visible disabilities. Can anyone unmute themselves and tell me some visible disabilities they can think of?
Someone on crutches.
Okay, perfect. What else? So someone on crutches.
Someone
what about
with a white cane?
Someone with a white cane? Yeah.
In a wheelchair.
In a wheelchair.
I know there's other people.
Yeah, no, there's a lot. And this is not an exhaustive list. So let's see. Physical disabilities that we might be able to see. Persons with visible assistive devices, somebody that has a very visible earpiece for either hearing or other needs. Someone with low mobility, someone with low vision who might have a cane, like you said. Someone with certain types of paralysis, a person with cerebral palsy, or a person exhibiting Tourette syndrome. Those are all things that we might consider pretty visible, that we might know by looking at someone. But what about invisible disabilities? Can anyone name any invisible disabilities?
Dyslexia.
Dyslexia, persons with autism.
Hearing impaired.
Many people in the deaf community, yes.
Mental illness.
Different types of mental illness are considered disabilities. So let's click and see some of these. Severe anxiety disorders, PTSD, panic disorders. And this is my absolute favorite because it's something I live with, obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. Chronic pain, issues that create chronic pain like fibromyalgia. Deaf persons, persons who are blind, Neurodivergent persons, depending on how they see themselves, they might be a person with an invisible disability. So you can see there's a lot. I'm going to go into a video really quickly, and it's going to showcase some visual disabilities that you might not be able to see by looking at someone.
Well, I made them double-sided, but then when I try to make a
So we're
bunch
seeing someone with cataracts, and their vision is very foggy.
I only made them double-sided just to save paper.
Then we're seeing someone with glaucoma, and the borders of their vision have closed in. Macular degeneration, where there is a large spot of vision that is missing in the middle of their field of vision. So that's just 3 quick examples. I don't know about you, but I'm probably not going to know if someone has macular degeneration, right? But that certainly, when you see that, I know the first time I watched it, my heart kind of stopped because he's biking, and then all of a sudden that whole middle of his field of vision is gone, right? I might not know someone talking to me at the front desk of a library has macular degeneration.
I'm on a meeting. No, I'm not on a meeting, but I'm watching a presentation. The State Library is doing a presentation on disabilities.
We can hear your microphone. I'm so sorry. All right. Can everyone hear me? All right. So here's a perfect example of things that meet ADA standards that don't work. This is the Hunters Point Library in Queens, New York. And it was built, this is a picture from 2019. It was new then. And this portion of the fiction section meets ADA requirements. Can anybody see any issue with it?
Skips.
Stairs. So if you are in a wheelchair or if you have a limited mobility, you could not reach these shelves. Now, the reason it meets ADA requirements is because technically a librarian or a library staff worker who did have full mobility could get up there and get you a book. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about minimizing the needs of persons with disabilities. I don't know about you, but if I was told I can't reach pretty much the entire fiction section of the library because, you know, people with brown hair can't go back there, I would consider that really discriminatory. And so this library did end up actually changing this up, adding an extra elevator area, and then moving these books somewhere else. But that's just a good example of the way ADA requirements being met are just the minimum legal requirement for access. Okay, look at this library sign. Does anybody see anything wrong with this library sign?
It doesn't have Braille on it.
Yeah, it has a picture of Braille. So if you cannot see this image, it says, due to limited space, the Braille collection has been moved. It is now located opposite the juvenile audiobook collection with a picture of someone reading Braille. However, if you need to read Braille, you could not read this sign. And so, you know, this was someone with good intentions, but accessibility was just not taken into account. So when we're talking about accessibility and usability, what I'm really looking at is that we get right here in the middle where usability and accessibility overlap so that things that are technically accessible with the ADA requirements are actually usable for people in different communities. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn this over for a minute to Miss Olivia.
Thank you, Norma. Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about this section on barriers to access by means of communication to our patrons. And our goal for this section, we're going to come out of this being able to answer the question, what can we do to remove communication barriers to all of our patrons? Next slide, please. All right, so let's start with the 4 types of communication barriers that we'll address specifically today. And we're going to separate them into physical, mental, perception-based, or attitudinal or attitude-based. And we're going to take these on one by one, and let's start with physical. And with physical barriers, we're thinking about things like aisle width. We need 6 feet for people to move. We're thinking about books that are shelved out of reach on high up shelves, or spaces that are only accessible by stairs. Like Norma showed before, a lack of braille posting, especially for patrons who regularly know to go to a place for their resources. If you don't have braille there, they're going to be left in the lurch. And generally, anything that you can think of physical in your library that is going to block a patron from accessing things that they need is a physical barrier. And I'm sure that everybody can picture a piece in their libraries that is a physical barrier to patrons with disabilities. Like in our library, we have this really nice space at the bottom and the center of our library of our rotunda where the kids love to play. And it's this maybe 15-foot circle that is circumferenced by a set of 2 stairs. And the kids love it because you can run around in there with your friends, but for a parent who is in a wheelchair or is otherwise restricted in mobility, it's a bit of a nightmare because your kid is in the middle of a 15-foot circle that you have no access to. So if you're a parent and you want to take your child to the library, knowing that there's a place that your kid can go that you just cannot reach, it's a huge barrier. Physical barrier for sure. Next kind of barriers that we'll address are mental barriers. And mental barriers are the barriers that are not physical, and these can be presented by library staff or be a part of your library's structure. And to find these mental barriers to surface, think about patrons with aphasia, with memory conditions, or with anxiety, or who have autism. And for them, is there anything in their way, non-physical, that is preventing them from accessing a librarian or service? So an example in our library, our youth services desk is right next to the picture book section. And our picture book section is the most highly trafficked section that we have. There's always a lot of people there. For a patron who has an anxiety issue or another condition that would prevent them from going around a large group of people, they're not going to want to go to the service desk because of the barrier that is there, this barrier of people. We address that at our library by leaving our desk sometimes and walking around and giving patrons the ability to choose where they can find their librarian to get some help. And I'm just going to take a breath. The next section that we have is perception-based barriers to communication. And these are very similar to mental barriers to communication, but are more likely to be presented by staff, by us. And going back to that example where we have a service desk that is surrounded by people, inaccessible to people who have a barrier presented by social situations like that. The mental barrier is created by that group of people at the desk. That's the non-physical wall that they can't breach. The perception-based barrier in the scenario is created if a staff person decides that they're going to stay at the desk under this idea that anyone who needs help can come to me. That's just not addressing the needs of all of your patrons. And that's blocking everybody off that can't meet the needs that we are presenting. So addressing barriers like these can be super hard because we're trained in these ways to stay at the desk, to remain visible, but that's not accessibility when you're not recognizing and addressing the barriers to service to every one of your patrons. And our last barrier is, I've got a nice example that sums it up better than I could. And I think we have a slide with a clip on the next page.
Yes.
Thanks, Norma. And it's from my favorite show, Speechless, which is about a family whose oldest son has cerebral palsy.
Let's go to school, shall we? Where's the wheelchair ramp? A garbage ramp? Not just a garbage ramp. No, it's a garbage in my son ramp. Okay, crash course in basic humility. Let's play a game I like to call trash or person. Are you Dr. Miller? Trash? Are you a person? I'm a person. Of course I am. Of course you are.
And that show's just full of great moments like that, where you're really presented with the reality of a society for people with disabilities.
I'm so sorry. I'm
You're
just
good.
trying to skip to the next one and it's giving me trouble.
I'm always here for more Minnie Driver. Love her.
I will just move to here and I will play it.
And thank you for switching that slide. I just asked Norma to do that maybe an hour ago to put that slide in because I love it so much. So superhero Norma.
There we go.
And
All right.
my favorite part of that clip, I don't know if you could see, and that principal's eyes, like there is this look of just crashing waves that she has been equating her students who use wheelchairs with garbage, and she didn't even know it. And we have, I'm sure, in all of our libraries, we have biases and barriers like this that are giving an unsaid message, unverbally said message to our patrons that is just as hurtful as what you saw in the clip. So as you walk through your library and you see different barriers, just try to ask yourself, what am I saying to a patron by having this barrier remain up? What does it say to a patron when your water fountain is accessible? Do you not deserve water? Do people not deserve water? And what does it say to your teenage or your middle grade patrons when your only Braille books that are available are picture books? You saying that you don't deserve to read chapter books. These are all unsaid messages that we can work on to try to fix our attitudinal bias, attitudinal barriers to our patrons. Next slide, please.
I think it's on
And
this one.
yes, this is the right one. Here's a list of ways that persons with disabilities are denied agency and access that we should be addressing when we give them service. So first we have that people with disabilities report that people often ignore them, underestimate their abilities, speak about them as if they are invisible, assume they cannot hear or understand, restrict them to answering yes or no questions, and pretending to understand them. I don't know about everybody else here, but I'm particularly guilty of this last one, especially in this day where we're wearing masks. It can be really hard to understand a patron, and patrons can get frustrated when you're trying to communicate with them and you're saying, I'm so sorry, can you say that just one more time? And it's already the 5th time. It can be really hard for them to come up with this ability to communicate, but the best way to get through is to just be kind to your patron, be kind to yourself, and just emphasize that you want to build a solid base for communication by understanding your patron's needs and preferences. Next slide, please. Oh, great, yes. And part of this includes adapting to the needs of your patrons. And there was a time when the term special was used as an inclusive term. And this video that Norma has found can be hurtful and a barrier to some of our patrons. So let's take a look.
People with Down syndrome have special needs. Special needs? Really? It would be special if people with Down syndrome needed to eat dinosaur eggs. That would be special. One dinosaur egg. Sure. If we need to wear a giant suit of armor, that would be special. I got it. Baby, girl, what's that? So darn it, get together. It would be special if we need to be massaged by a cat. If we needed to be woken up by celebrity. They know me from Scrubs or Office Space. Dark Phoenix, Rock, Platoon, Wall Street, Funny Stupid. That's that would be special. But what we really need is education, jobs, and opportunities, friends, and some love. Just like anybody else. Are these needs special?
I just thought that's such a good message because it's just gently probing this question of what am I communicating when I use this term that I was taught was the right way to address an issue, but really when my patrons hear it, what are they hearing? Just readdressing that issue and trying to be right to your patrons. And continuing on that point, we have another example here of how some of us have learned to use person-first language when addressing patrons with disabilities. And there's a lot of different viewpoints on this issue. I'll just read from the slide. Some communities, particularly the deaf and some neurodivergent communities, prefer to use identity-first language. They built a community around this identity of being deaf or being neurodivergent. And you can't read how someone's going to want to identify from their face. But it might be uncomfortable for you as a staff member to build your communication with your patron by asking these questions, like to clarify what you want to build a relationship with your patrons with. But getting that base level of communication is really important. So good practice is using person-first language unless informed otherwise, and better practice is to ask for the person's preference. If you are able, and we're not always able because patrons can be in a rush, want to go somewhere else, we can just go with the flow. Next slide, please. All right, last slide here. Some tips for inclusive communication. Don't make assumptions about a person that comes over to your desk. If a person with a disability comes to the desk with a question and they have another person with them, don't try to talk to the other person if the person who came to you first has a disability and they have the question. Try to address it directly to them because they're wanting help from you. And that can be hard, especially with patrons who can't communicate verbally. But that's where access comes in with the second point. Keep alternative communication modes available. So your whiteboards and markers, your pens and paper, knowing which staff members speak ASL, use ASL or speak other languages, and asking them to come by. These are steps that you can all have in your arsenal to get ready for providing access for all of your patrons. Number 3 is the one that I find the most challenging, asking if you need clarification. And the difference between a kind question and a probing question is really subtle because it's never right to ask a patron, what's your disability? That's not a kind way to talk to anybody. But if you want to ask, can I help you to our section on books and Braille? Or even better, having that information clear and available to patrons without them requiring assistance from a librarian, that can help break down barriers that keep people from utilizing resources. And our very last piece here, respect the person's preferences. And as staff, our brains are balancing so many hours of training and protocol and procedures with being able to converse with patrons like people. And at the end of the day, respecting the preferences of the people that come to you is the highest priority. And that takes talking to them and learning about who they are and what they need. And I had a conversation that I was really grateful for with the mom of a boy who's blind in our library. And he had been in a photo in the local paper of an event, and the caption had highlighted the fact that he had a sight disability. And I said something to her like, oh, the picture of your boy was so cute in the paper. And she got very uncomfortable. She said something like, oh, haha, yeah. And that made me uncomfortable because I thought I had touched on an issue that wasn't for me. And it felt like if I had left it at that point, that was going to be another barrier between me and this patron. And I asked her if everything was all right. And that's when she told me that she feels pressured to take pictures with her kid when she is asked to, and in this situation was pressured to take a picture for the paper. And after I got that clear with her, we got her books, she left, but I was grateful for that interaction because it informed me as a staff member that this patron is not comfortable taking photos, and as youth services staff, that's a huge part of our job. And now I know that this patron is not okay with that, and I learned a lot about respect in that interaction. And that's it for my section. Thank you for listening, and I'm glad to get to talk with you guys about accessibility.
Thank you, Olivia. So all of this stuff that we've gone over is basically the awareness part. So this is providing training and education resources at your library on accessibility topics. And we're going to give you a good number of resources to get started on this with your own libraries. My background, as I said earlier, is schools. I was specifically a preschool director for many years. And I found that a lot of times we went to trainings that just didn't give us any usable tools. You know, they talked about issues, but there was hardly ever trainings that gave you usable tools. So one of the things we really wanted to do when putting this together is just get a list of things that you can start doing that you can actually, you know, hold in your hands and say, I can do these things. So the second part for us has been working on collaborations. Now, this, I think, for some libraries will be more difficult than others. It kind of depends on what your setup is. You know, are you under a board? Are you under a city council? Like it kind of depends. So you need to look at your library, talk to your administrators, see what are the parameters you're working within there. Next, we'll talk about auditing your library, using your available resources and developing a plan, where you're at now, where you want to go, and how do you get there. So collaborations, go back to this a little bit. So again, what boundaries does your organization have? You know, some libraries are able to partner with basically anybody they can partner with. Some are a little more structured, but you can always find a place to start. So one of the places to start obviously is New Mexico State libraries, right? If you are not a depository for library for the blind and print disabled, you can still have things at your library that help connect patrons to that. So instead of just saying, well, if you need these services, go get in touch with the New Mexico Library for the Blind and Print Disabled, you can have the forms ready, printed out. You can have good signage and communicate with your patrons that might be in need of these services. And you can even help them fill out the forms. I don't know if you've ever looked on there, but one of the jobs besides doctors and social workers that can say, yes, this patron needs a service is librarians. So don't keep those hidden away in a little back room for somebody to have to go through 3 or 4 barriers like Olivia talked about to get to connected with some organization that they might need. Include members of the community when evaluating your library. This can be very deliberate, or this can be conversations you have with patrons you know well. I know that we have a couple of patrons who are part of a kind of a low vision book club, and they're really good about telling me, hey, you know, I noticed this, you know, you have a new gate when we got new 3M gates. They're beautiful. The top of them is clear, so you could not see the top of them from the door. And that was not something that when it was purchased, you know, many moons back or many months back, it was thought about probably. And so that's just a matter of us like ordering visible tape and placing some on there so that it's more visible. Referring patrons to more specialized programs when needed. Again, we cannot provide every service. I think in libraries, we feel bad when we can't do something, but we do as much as we can. And then we connect people to other programs, to other more specialized organizations when we don't have the ability to provide something, rather than just saying, oh, we don't have that. Well, who does have that? You know, have lists of where you can refer patrons. Auditing, auditing super important. I think it's very intimidating. There are a lot of resources out there that have pre-made templates. You can use them as the templates are, or as guidance to create your own, which is what we did. We ended up and did kind of a Google Forms survey, but we made sure to include accessible options. So we have print options, and we have the option of I will walk you through the library if I need to. We have Word documents and PDFs. A word on that for PDFs. PDFs are not always accessible. Certain kinds of PDFs are accessible and certain kinds are not, because your computer does see a PDF as an image. So you need to make sure when you're saving it, that you're saving it through ways that will make a PDF readable to a screen reader if someone uses a screen reader. Focus on making sure that the audit addresses your library's needs. So our library is not every library, and vice versa. Our library has 3 floors, so we might spend more time on, you know, signage for different floors and making sure elevator space is accessible, whereas a library that only has 1 floor is not going to need to work on that as much. Take your time. I know for me, I felt pressured really when we were putting ours together to kind of like, we got to get it out there, we got to do, but it's important to take as much time as you need to get that initial audit done so that you do a good job with it. Make sure you use staff, make sure you have staff audit different areas, because the area we work in, we get used to it and we don't always see the things that are not accessible. So have staff do the whole library, have board members do the library, have patrons do the library, and take your time with getting there. And then don't forget future audits. This is not kind of a one and done thing. This is where are we initially, where we need to see where we are so we can know where we're going. And so I know we've set up to have like a biannual audit or an annual audit in the future, just depending on, you know, what it takes us to get where we want to go. And library plans, putting together a plan for yourself. Find out about your physical and financial restraints. You know, maybe you see a very obvious accessibility issue with a wall and that's a load bearing wall and you're not going to be able to take it out. You're not really in charge of that probably at your library. And so your job is more going to be, how do I make this space usable? So if this is not super accessible, maybe we put something there that nobody needs to access, right? Maybe this is not a wall where we place stacks. This is not a wall where we place children's toys because it's not accessible. Create a roadmap so that you have flexibility built into your plan. So rather than saying, I'm going to do X, 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 and X, and then getting frustrated because you can't complete all of those things due to restraints, whether they're financial or physical, create a roadmap. You know, we want to get here first. So for us, that meant dividing our tasks into more doable chunks or stages. And for us, that was pretty fiscal. We have a library that is built around a large rotunda. And so I can't knock those walls out. I don't like them. And there's probably some accessibility issues with them, but that is not something I'm worrying about. I'm worrying about, do we have good signage by the front desk? Do we have alternative modes of communication? Do we have accessible computers that have a mouse that is more accessible for people with low mobility? So that's that low hanging fruit that you want to go for first. And then finally, don't reinvent the wheel. If there are templates out there, if there are plans out there that you can utilize, even if you're just going through and getting your ideas from there, use them. I know that none of us have tons of time and tons of money to be making all of these things work. We can use the work of other people who have already done all of that to get there. So these are just 5 quick tips to get started that helped us. Add a communication option and a chair at the front desk. It seems like a no-brainer, but to us, it was like, oh, a chair. When people come up, they decide whether to use it or not. I don't look at somebody and say, oh, this person looks like they have a mobility disability, they need to sit down. I ask, you're welcome to take a seat if you'd like to, and people decide whether to use it or not. It gets used a lot. And it's not always by somebody with a visible disability. Sometimes it's by a mom who has 2 small children, who's trying to juggle all of that stuff while filling out something for the library or checking out her books. A communication option for us, it's a whiteboard or a pad and paper as well as, like Olivia said, knowing who speaks different languages, who is able to use ASL. But it can be that simple, and it feels strange sometimes when you say, okay, this patron has told me this 5 times. I can't hear this. I feel bad writing it down, but I'd rather feel bad myself writing it down and be able to communicate that with that patron than not communicate at all. So I have plenty of patrons who maybe are losing their hearing but aren't aware of it, or maybe just can't hear through all the masks. And we've learned that they, you know, if they choose to, they'll write something down for me, and it'll be so much easier. So number 2, use accessible print guidelines. The issue that I see in our library and other libraries a lot is we have these cool things, you know, we use products online to do these great flyers and stuff, and they're not accessible. Number 1, if they're online, they're not accessible because there's no alternative text for images. So if someone's using a screen reader, they can't use it. If they're paper signs, they have all these cool colors and cool fonts, and it's completely unreadable for someone who has color blindness, or someone who has low vision, or someone with dyslexia. So just, there are lots of places, and I will include resources for all of this stuff that we're talking about, including some print guidelines that have been put together by universities that have done the work of doing the research to tell you what makes print products or online products more accessible. Number 4, include closed captioning when you're doing library programming. And that was something that I know I communicated about this presentation, is that as much as possible, we need to just make that part of our norm for doing programming or having trainings, is we have closed captioning or other print options for persons who need it. Put your slideshow on a USB. So if somebody needs to take it home to put it in their own computer where they have all of their accessible software, then they can do that. Number 5, this one's super simple. And again, I'll include some examples for you guys. Free extensions, add them to your browser. I personally use Chrome. They've got tons and tons of extensions. I have a color blindness checker. I have a website accessibility checker. I have a print image checker that makes sure I have my alt text added. Look at your emails. I know for us, we use county branding on all of our emails. That county branding is an image. So if someone's using a screen reader and it gets to the bottom, it says, you know, thank you, Norma Covington. And then the screen reader just says image. That person can't see that it says Los Alamos County Public Libraries. I have to go in and add the alt text to that image, which takes me 2 seconds. And then if someone's using a screen reader and I send them an email, they're now going to see, oh, they're emailing from the library. All right. So we have a few minutes, about 10 minutes. I wanted to leave some time up for some questioning. And let me see if I can open the chat. And Audra has dropped in, it looks like, a link to the presentation and a list of free and cheap items. I think there's another link that we have too. Audra, do we have another link? Do we have 3? Okay, what would I define? Yes, Audra answered this question perfectly. My mouse with a trackball is much more accessible. So it's good to just have at least one of those at your computer is more. You'll often find that when you add more accessible options, they not only benefit the community that you're thinking about when you're purchasing it or implementing it, but they just benefit everybody. An accessible door is a door that's better for everybody. An accessible mouse, the trackball allows you to grab the mouse and not need such fine motor skills to use the mouse. So that's helpful for your young people. That's helpful for older patrons who are losing some mobility. That's helpful for persons with mobility disabilities. Please use these links that we have in the chat. Everything I talked about, there's examples of all of the different plans, all of the different things, a list of free and cheap items that we've started to implement. Olivia talked earlier about not being able to reach top shelves. I know in our library, we have a huge collection. I can't say, let's just get rid of all the top shelves because I'm not in charge of that. What I can do is I can get shelf readers or cheaper options, and I can have signs in a visible large print that say, you know, please ask at the desk. Now that's not perfect. I still don't like that, but I am providing accessibility where before there was none. Because I don't know about you, I'm rather short. When I'm at the store and I can't reach something, I feel super embarrassed to ask a lot of times. So if we can make it quite clear that we know that this is not perfectly accessible and we are going to do the work to make that more accessible, that's helpful to people just to know. Put pictures of your meeting rooms and study rooms on your website. We're adding those as I speak. So that persons with anxiety disorders, persons who need to know what a room looks like because they've got issues with sensory things, they can see that online before they go to your library. They can be prepared. Again, that's not, you know, the library still may not be perfect, but you've provided additional accessibility options for someone who might need them. Does anyone have any questions? And you can drop them in the chat if you're not comfortable speaking up, because I know not everybody's comfortable on speaking in front of people. Are there any audit templates that you could recommend? Yes, I recommend in the list of resources there above your message, Project Enable. Project Enable is, they provide training specifically focused on educators and libraries for increasing accessibility. They've got a great training that you can utilize. They've got a train the trainer thing as well, which is a little more intense, that I did. And they have a couple of different types of audits that I used kind of to build off of, but they go over all of the different things that you might want to use. I would also recommend the Tarjan Center at UCLA has they have a whole page full of their accessibility work. They've got some great print guidelines and some audit recommendations. Anyone else? I'll give it another minute.
Hi,
See if
can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Maureen Wakando, and I'm the interim librarian at the Jemez Pueblo Community Library. I myself have a physical disability. I'm bound to a wheelchair. So I use a wheelchair to get around. And the library that I work at wasn't handicap accessible, wheelchair accessible. But over the years, we've made it somewhat accessible. I know that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. However, I'm very thankful for this presentation, this webinar. It's made me think about a lot of the other population, because there is disability that is not visible. And how do we go about addressing them? I know that we have a few that are hard of hearing. And so with wearing the face mask, it's hard because they're not able to read the lips like they normally would. So how do we do that? But here in the community, because we're closed in and we're still on lockdown to the end of the year, we're able to, social distance, but I take my chances and I'm probably risking it, but I lift my mask down just for that moment for them to read my lips. So But yes, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for this webinar, and I look forward to the resources that you have to provide and things that we can piggyback off of.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think what you said is so important about thinking about what are our own, many of us may identify as having a disability. Like I said, I have OCD, and I know there are things that I have great difficulty doing if I can do them at all. And I see from my perspective, but I have to step outside myself and try and see from other people's perspective. I'm not somebody who has a physical disability who's in need of a wheelchair, but I have to think about someone who is and what they need from my library that they're not getting. And I think with when we're talking about the deaf community, the person who presented with us at NMLA, Christy Mackey, is actually a deaf educator. And one of the things we've talked about is having options and asking what they need. And so I personally do not speak ASL. I am trying to learn more so that I can have limited conversation with people. We do have someone currently at the library that is fluent in ASL, but that's not going to be every library. But I have a whiteboard. I have a pen and paper. I have other options that I can consider, like you said, I pulled down my mask the other day to work with a patron who needed to read lips. With OCD, that's really hard for me to do because I'm already concerned about contamination all the time, much less in this time that we're living in. And my first thought when it was over was, we need to invest in some of those clear masks that are approved for the deaf community that help us to read lips, right? So I think that's a place to go. We might not be able to provide those for ourselves. That might be an option where we're looking at speaking with an organization and saying, hey, we want to provide better service to our deaf community. Can you sponsor us by giving us a few of those masks? And again, it'll vary from community to community. I am a native New Mexican. I'm from Anthony, New Mexico, down there at the very bottom. People forget we're there, outside of Las Cruces. And I know that we're such a small state, and we're a state that doesn't always have a ton of money to throw at issues, but we're also hard workers. We're also, I think, very innovative, and we're also very close. Everyone I know who's from New Mexico loves New Mexico and wants to, well, I wouldn't say everyone, I guess that would be, but we care about our state, we care about our patrons, we care about our people. I think that if we work together on this, we can come up with ideas for other places. Maybe it doesn't work for me, but maybe it works for your library. So anybody here can email me. I'll drop my email in the chat. You can, I'm not going to speak for Olivia, but I guess I will speak for Audra. You can email Audra as well. And keep in touch. I have people who went to us at NMLA who are still emailing us saying, hey, I found out about this thing. And I think I'm looking at putting together kind of a Reddit thread type thing so that we can all continue to talk about these issues and continue to come up with solutions.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia and Norma and Audra. Apologies, both Dale and I are having technical difficulties, so we can't get our videos on, but this has been an excellent presentation, and thank you for all the resources, and thanks for giving us your email for any future questions that we have. So can we all give the Los Alamos group a virtual round of applause one way or another? Great job. Thanks again. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye. My Zoom totally locked up, and I could hear you guys, but I couldn't do anything. So I was emailing with Dale, and he was having the exact same problem. So I don't know what's going on. Question is how to stop the recording.
I doubt you can hear me because it shows me muted, but I can't stop.
Hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, well, my screen still shows me muted, but I can't even leave or stop things. so-
Yeah. Okay. So I logged into Zoom and I'm just going to end the meeting and hope that the recording is saved because there's nothing else I can do.
Yep.
All right. Thanks. See ya. Bye, everyone.
Bye.